Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, that was just like the old days. Almost. Oh, look how quiet they got. How nice. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off or silence it at this time. This evening in this room, we will have our second, and this is the spring version, seed swap that Julia organizes. So there'll be several experts here, and you'll have an opportunity to bring seeds and swap them for other seeds. So do that. We still have copies of Driving the Green Book with Alvin Hall upstairs, and I have some here if you're interested. Friends of the Library. Who's interested in Friends of the Library? Friends of the Library. See Chuck Julian, he has membership cards and other information for you. He's right there.
Right here. Glad to have you.
We need friends.
And we are very interested in the library levy. This is one of our big projects. So if you're interested in the library levy passing, join the friends.
Yes. What Chuck said. Okay. Next week, Rust Belt Union Blues with Laney Newman and Thetis Goatpole. They're two big shots from Harvard, so don't miss that one. And the 19th, we have our St. Patrick's Day celebration, 363 days until St. Patrick's Day, because we sort of missed it a little bit, with County Mayo Irish Band. Our guest today is Allison Fredette.
John, before you go on, could I just make one other quick pitch? The Friends are looking for volunteers to work at the book sale on April the 12th and 13th. I have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to sign up for a 2-hour block of time to work. You get to see all the wonderful books on sale. Thank you.
There you go. I know some of you already helped with that, but we could use some help. Allison Fredette is an assistant professor of history at Appalachian State University. She earned a BA and MA from WVU and completed her PhD in American history at the University of Florida. She studies the 19th century American South, as well as the history of marriage, gender, and the family. Her first book, Marriage on the Border, Love, Mutuality, and Divorce in the Upper South During the Civil War, explores the connections between place and attitudes toward marriage and gender roles in the border South states of Kentucky and West Virginia during the mid-19th century. Her second book that she's talking about today is an edited collection called Heartsick and Astonished, Divorce in Civil War Era West Virginia, and it brings together some of the most intriguing divorce cases from Ohio County in the mid-19th century. So here is Allison Fredette.
All right, thank you all for coming out. So again, the talk I'm giving today is just to kind of highlight some of the themes of this collection. So this is a collection, so between the years 1850 and 1873, over 130 citizens of Ohio County were involved in divorce cases. So there were 66 divorce cases filed in that 23-year period. And so my book is a sample. It features 27 of those cases that I felt like best represent the process of divorce, what it was like to live in Wheeling in this era, the lives of those living in Wheeling, and the impact of the Civil War on marriages in Ohio County. So how this works is the book itself is actually, it's an introduction that I wrote that kind of introduces you to what is divorce, what have historians said about divorce in this era, what's going on in Wheeling, what's happening in the Civil War. And then I actually just have transcribed these full cases, these full 27 cases. And for each of those, wherever possible, I looked up, you know, the person who filed, the person, the husband and wife, the judge, the lawyers involved, any of the witnesses I could, and I tried to give some background on those as much as I could. It's often very hard to find. A lot of these cases are working class citizens of Wheeling, so they can be a little bit harder to track down. The judges, I've got a lot on the judges, but it's harder to track down the everyday people. And so that's what the book itself looks like. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in that introduction, why wheeling, why divorce, and then I'm going to go over 4 different cases and kind of give you a flavor of what these divorces actually look like. Okay, so first of all, where did the idea for this book come from? So as you heard already, my first book looked at marriage and divorce in the border South, specifically in the states of Kentucky and West Virginia during the mid-19th century. And for that book, I was really interested in looking at the ways in which West Virginia and Kentucky, because they were border states, were also places where you had a lot of ideas overlapping and in contact. I saw these border places as the borders. They're places in between. So there are places where you see a mixture of economic, political, social, ethnic, racial differences, and that leads to kind of newer ideas. And so what I was specifically looking at is how is marriage and divorce, how does it look different in places like West Virginia and Kentucky than in other southern states? So I was really thinking about the ways in which, when I looked at letters between husbands and wives, when I looked at advice manuals, how couples in this region were advised to be much more a partnership of mutuals than in other southern states. They're certainly not equals, like we might think of marriages today, but they see each other more as this partnership. They have important roles to play. I also thought a lot about how there was more acceptance of divorce in these places than in other parts of the South. It's still not going to be widely practiced, obviously, but you're going to see divorce more commonly happening in Kentucky and West Virginia than you are in places like South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi. And so I really said that had to do with the fact that these were these border places, these places in between. And then specifically, this project started way back when I was a master's student at West Virginia University. And I just knew I wanted to study what West Virginia was like, and I wanted to study women's history. I didn't know how to do that, and my dad worked at the archives, and one day he came to me and he handed me a drawer of a card catalog, which many of you probably know what that is, but when I tell my students this, they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I have to Google it and show them, and then I'll be like, this was a real thing. So he handed me this drawer, and it had all of these divorces listed for wheeling, which is the only set of divorce cases the West Virginia collection has in Morgantown. It's just the Ohio County records. I don't know how. Honestly, they're kind of some of the only divorce records that exist in the 19th century from West Virginia. It's really hard to find divorce cases from the 19th century. You can find pockets of them here and there. If the local courthouse has preserved them, which not every courthouse did. Luckily, Ohio County apparently did, and not only did, but got them into an archive so that they could get into the hands of researchers. And then the West Virginia collection kindly let me publish them in a book, so now they can be in anyone's hands. So that's where this all came from. And wheeling became just a great example of some of these border ideas that I was thinking about. It's part of the South, but as we all know, being in Wheeling, it's in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. So it's much farther north than most other southern places. It still has slavery, but it's very different by 1860 than in other southern places. It's a community where a quarter of the population in 1860 is foreign born. So it looks very different than other southern states. It's also right on the edge of the Ohio River, which is this kind of gateway to the west. So I really saw it as this kind of perfect place to look at these trends. And so that's why I really focused in on Wheeling here. So then why did I focus on divorce cases beyond the fact that my dad handed them to me? There's a number of things that I think we can learn as historians from looking at divorce cases. First of all, this is the era, obviously, in the mid-19th century, where the women's rights movement in the United States is really taking off. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the leaders of the women's rights movement, really sees marriage and family law as the front on which this is going to be fought. She kind of sees, like, yes, we want to have the right to vote, but something she sees every woman as experiencing is marriage and family law. Susan B. Anthony, who's single, might say differently, but that's what Elizabeth Cady Stanton thinks. So divorce law is changing constantly throughout the 19th century. And so I think it's really interesting to look in one place and see how can we see divorce law kind of progressing in this era, looking at this one community. I also think we could learn a lot about what people expected men and women to behave like in a relationship by looking at what they file in those divorce records. So basically someone goes into a court and says, I want to divorce this person because they didn't do this, this, and this. And so now we know they wanted that person to do this, this, and that. So it allows us to learn what are gendered expectations like in marriages. And then I think for me, as someone who grew up in West Virginia, it's another way to learn about the differences between West Virginia and Virginia that potentially led them to separate. People don't normally think about that with divorce law and women's rights, but it is there, and they are actually discussing these things in the statehood convention, that they feel like Virginia has not given women enough rights and they'd like to do better. And so I think it's really interesting to look at Wheeling, for instance, and see, all right, so before the Civil War, they had to use Virginia law, but they didn't like it. How did they deal with that? And then how did they change that after the Civil War? And what does that help us learn about the difference in this state from Virginia? And then I just think they're a really great resource for learning about the lives of everyday people in the past. I'm a social historian. I'm the most interested in everyday lives. And especially, like I said, since a lot of these people are immigrants, they're working class, they're not leaving records elsewhere. These might be the only things that I have of them. But it can be a really interesting snapshot of not only what are their marriages like, but what does their house look like? What is their relationship with their neighbors like? All these little hints of the just flavor of everyday life. So that's why I think divorce cases are really, really fascinating sources to use. All right, so this is obviously a map of the United States in 1860. It shows the division between slave states, free states, and the territories. And again, it kind of gives you that sense of how this area I'm looking at is on this edge between slave and free in this era. All right, so now, before I get into what a divorce looks like, let's talk about what it actually looked like to get a divorce in Wheeling in this era. So the first thing you would do, as it might be today, you would get a lawyer. Obviously, most of the people in these cases don't actually know what the legal code says about divorce, so they have to go to a lawyer who explains to them, this is what you actually need to do to get a divorce. And did your husband do this? Did he do that? And so what's interesting about these cases is how often, we don't know this, how often do they say, oh yes, it happens to be that he's done those things? Or how often do they say, well, I could tell you he did those things. Will that work? Because I think that does happen. But they need to have a lawyer to help them through that process. The next thing they do is that they file a bill of divorce. So this is the actual document in which they say, all right, who is the couple? When did they get married? Who wants a divorce? So wife wants a divorce from husband, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you want a divorce? So what are you basically accusing that person of that says this is grounds for divorce? What kind of divorce do you want? So in the 19th century, there are two kinds of divorces. There's a divorce called an absolute divorce, which is how we would conceptualize divorce when we say divorce now, which would mean you are no longer married, you're not financially entangled with one another, and you can remarry. If you don't get that, you can get something that's called a separation from bed and board, and that means you don't live together anymore, you're not financially entangled anymore, but you can't remarry. So it's a little more like a legal separation. And there are different things that you have to accuse a person of to get either of those. And then, of course, you have any other requests. Do you want alimony? Do you want the person to pay your lawyer's fees? Do you want custody? So you lay all of that out in the petition. And so again, in my book, I have the first in every one of these cases is this petition. So in the 19th century, divorce was known as fault-based divorce. So today we have more often no-fault divorce, which would basically mean if you go into a courtroom and you want a divorce, you can say, we would like a divorce for irreconcilable differences. We want a divorce because we just don't want to be married anymore. And the court's like, okay, well, that's fine. In the 19th century, that was not fine. They did not want you to do that. So in the 19th century, you had to go into a court and you had to say someone was at fault in the divorce. And not only that, you had to not be at fault. They wanted to see there was a situation where someone had done something wrong and the other person had been on their best behavior. And they actually would say, if you both have done something wrong, you kind of deserve each other. So we're just, and that's where, again, a lot of these people, they're filing, they're like accusing their husband, say, of adultery, but then they also have to say, meanwhile, I've been a wonderful wife. So they have to really sell that. Of course, divorce law is state specific, so you can see state by state differences in what they will allow people to file for. There's a large variation in the 19th century. And often it is kind of on a north-south basis, although there are exceptions. New York State, for instance, has one of the most narrow divorce laws in the country. So in fact, if you lived in New York, what a lot of people would do is they would take the train to Indiana and they would live there for a year and they would file for divorce in Indiana. Apparently it was like, Indiana was like where you went to get a divorce. It was crazy there. In the 20th century, that's Nevada. And you only had to live there for 6 months. And in the only state in the 19th century where you could not get a divorce at all in this era is in South Carolina. So South Carolina, after the Civil War, has like a 15-year period where they allow divorces and then they get rid of it again. So there's all sorts of differences. So again, what I also find really interesting, I often teach with divorce cases with my students, because I think they're really interesting documents because it really shows us the way everything we read in the past, we have to read with some level of skepticism. We can't just accept that what is on the paper is true. And again, in a divorce case, we know that a person going into a courtroom wants to get a divorce. And so they know I have to tell that judge certain things and I have to sell them on a story to make that happen. So these are what I call constructed narratives. And I think it's really interesting to work with documents that are so slippery like this. And I also think we can learn a lot from what the narratives they choose to tell are. Okay, so after you file your bill of divorce, the court then issues a summons. So if a wife files for divorce against a husband, the court will issue a summons to the husband. What's interesting about Ohio County is in other parts of Virginia, if you ignore that summons, you get a $100 fine, which is a lot in this era. Ohio County, they just quietly do away with that. So if you don't answer it, that's fine. Nothing really happens to you. And I think that's really interesting because quite frankly, if you don't answer it, the divorce is much more likely to happen. The court is much more in favor of a divorce where someone is not kind of objecting to it. Because you really have two options. If you get a summons, you can object to it, or you can say, I also would like a divorce, but the court doesn't like that either. So if you really want a divorce, your best option might be to just ignore it. Pretend you're not home that day or something. Of course, some of these people genuinely aren't home. They got on a riverboat and went out and they're out of the county. But some of these cases, I think they are just carefully ignoring them. If the summons is not responded to, then you do have to file a notice for 4 straight weeks in the newspaper. The idea would be like, even if they didn't accept the summons, you've gotten that message out there that you're divorcing them, so you've announced it. Then after that, you have to take depositions. So in each of these cases, you have to bring people forward that kind of are character witnesses for you and talk about what your partner did wrong and what they saw. And those, I think, are the really fascinating parts of these cases. And then finally, the court ultimately decides in what's known as a decree, do you get your divorce or do you not get your divorce? Okay, in Ohio County in the 23-year period I'm looking at, they granted 70% of the divorce cases, which is a really high amount for courts to be granting divorces in this era. So that's one of the things when I was looking at, I ended up looking at 6 counties for my first book. This is by far the county that gets the most. And I think that's really fascinating to think about why that is the case. Okay, so what did the actual law say? So in before 1863, obviously where we are now was part of the state of Virginia, so they had to follow Virginia code. So Virginia Code said, so that first kind of absolute full divorce, to do that, you had only 3 options. You could get an absolute divorce if your partner committed adultery. You have to prove that they committed adultery. If you can prove impotency, and if your partner has been in prison for 7 or more years. So apparently if they were in for 6, you were just out of luck. So if you want this kind of lesser form of divorce from bed and board, you could charge them with cruelty, abandonment of 5 or more years, and that's it. Those are your only options. So these are, it's pretty stringent as divorce law goes. After the war, West Virginians are using West Virginia law, and it looks a little bit different. So they still say absolute divorce, adultery, and impotency, but they put no time limit on imprisonment. They're like, any prison time, we're gonna let you off the hook there. They've moved abandonment, which was in Virginia law under bed and board. It's now an absolute divorce, and it's only 3 years. So you just have to prove that person abandoned you for 3 years. They also have this interesting category that's like a catch-all for fraud. And they say, well, if the wife was pregnant at the time you got married, if the wife was, quote, notoriously a prostitute, if the husband was, quote, notoriously a licentious person, all of those have to be at the time of the marriage. So, and that had to be something you say you didn't know about at the time of the marriage. So these do happen where they're like, I did not know she was 8 months pregnant at the time of the marriage. Could have fooled me. I mean, the dresses are big. What's also interesting about this is kind of unusually for the time period to have a spot where you could accuse a husband of being a licentious person is a little bit unusual. Usually those are kind of all lumped on, you know, if your wife has been doing these things. So it's a little bit interesting that they allow that divorce there for the husband. And of course, as I tell my students, just because it's there doesn't mean people are actually successfully using it in a court, but it's interesting that it's there. And then if you want a divorce from bed and board, you can have cruelty, abandonment if it's less than 3 years. And then during the 19th century, if a husband accused his wife of being a prostitute, but she wasn't, that was considered mental cruelty on his part, so she could file for divorce. And actually, that one gets used a lot. So apparently that was happening a lot. Okay, so like I said, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few sample cases just to give you an idea of what these cases actually look like. I should say I like having visuals in my show, but I don't have any images of these people. So I apologize to whoever these couples are. They probably were very happy in their relationships and did not want to be in this. Yeah, I don't even know if she's like, these are usually people that I've found that are labeled unknown man and woman. So maybe it's the Wells, but it's probably not. So I just like to say that because they didn't ask to be involved in this slideshow. All right, so Christina Wells married Levi Wells on May 24th, 1842 in Wheeling. So they were married about 15 years at the time of this divorce. And when she files, she basically says, things have changed over the last few years in our marriage. She says, basically, he is not providing for me anymore. He is neglecting the household. Like, his responsibility is to take care of me and support me, and he's not doing that. And she says, not only that, but I am working. And a lot of the women in these cases are working. She's a milliner. And she says, I'm working, so I'm trying. But he keeps taking all the money that I'm earning because under married women's property laws in the 19th century, nothing she earns is her own, it's her husband's. And she says he's taking all of it and then he's drinking it away. So he is drinking and spending all of this money. And meanwhile, I'm in poor health and I can't support myself. She says on top of that, he is committing repeated acts of adultery. So she says, I know that he has specifically committed adultery with Annie O'Brien. So she names the person. And then she says also he's just like generally in the habit of visiting, quote, houses of ill fame inhabited by loose and lewd women. If you're interested, there are multiple stories about prostitution in this book. Clearly there was a thriving prostitution industry in Wheeling in this era. So she says, though, but specifically, I know that in January of 1857, he visited Annie O'Brien, and there he had, quote, carnal connection with her. So the interesting thing about this case versus some of the other cases I have is that Annie is one of the people that comes and testifies. So she says Annie is committing adultery with my husband, and Annie comes to the court and actually testifies. So Annie says, yeah, I knew Levi for about a week. I only knew him for like a week. And her exact quote is, during the last winter, I think January or February, I boarded for a week at the house of a woman named Jane Street who lived on Monroe Street in the city of Wheeling. While I was there, I saw Wells there often. Saw him give this woman money several times. Saw him bring her victuals and provisions. He told me that he had been the keeper of her and her baby. He came there in the evening after night. I believe she was a woman of bad character. So Annie's like, it wasn't me. It was just in the house. He was visiting this other woman, which is interesting because every single other person who testifies says he's having an affair with Annie. A.A. Adams actually says he rents the room to Annie or to Levi for Annie, so that Levi comes to him and says, like, I have this woman, can you rent her a room? And apparently Adams says, I only want women who have good reputation. He was like, oh, she's a widow, she's got 4 children, she's Catholic, it's gonna be great. And Adams says basically she moves in and immediately one of the other tenants comes and says, that woman you just rented that room to, she was with this other woman that I know was running a house of bad repute. And so he's like, uh-oh, we got to get her out. So he says, it took me 2 weeks to get her out of the house and I never got my money. So he's very mad about that. Another person who testifies is Samuel Smith, who is the jailer of Ohio County. And he testifies and says that Levi Wells is actually currently in jail. That he actually asked him to smuggle out a letter to Annie O'Brien. And he says, don't worry. He's basically like, he gave me this letter, told me to take it to Annie, but I thought I'd bring it to the court instead. So we have the letter, which is unusual. I'm going to read it to you now. It's in the book. It's printed as it is actually written. It really reflects the, clearly he is someone who's literate because he could write this letter, but it has very, let's say, phonetic spelling. So you can tell that though he can write, he's not incredibly well educated. So the letter was written on February 13th, 1857. And he says, it is with pleasure I take a portion of my lonely time in this prison house to address you, feeling as I do for being so long from your kind embraces and arms. Did you but know how I feel for you, I know your heart would break. You know that I am here for no crime but jealousy. So my dear, be of good cheer and do not be discouraged, for all that I promise you, I will perform. You see, my love is true. It gets better the more it is tried. I told the jailer that you was my washwoman. So now you can call and tell him you wash for me. If you can get along till I get out, I will go all the way with you and get married. I will have a divorce as soon as the court acts. So what's interesting about this letter is that what I didn't tell you is that when Christina filed for divorce, they issued that summons and Levi did not answer it, even though clearly he's in Wheeling. And he knows that the divorce is happening because he's writing in this letter, don't worry, I'm going to get my divorce soon. So I think this is a really interesting case of the way in which we see this couple kind of working together a little bit. They probably have very different reasons why they want this divorce, but he knows if I just ignore this summons, then it's much more likely that she's gonna get her divorce, and then I'll get what I want, which is apparently to marry Annie O'Brien. And he's right, because in May of 1857, the court grants the divorce, and they can both go on their merry way. Unfortunately, I have no idea if he marries Annie O'Brien because I wasn't able to find either of them in the census after this. I do occasionally find some people, but I wasn't able to find. I have based on Christina's maiden name, I think she does remarry. So there's someone that I think could be her and that she does remarry, but I wasn't able to find Levi or Annie again. So that's the end of the story that I have for them. Another case that kind of shows the darker side of a lot of these cases is the case of Margaret Bull and William Bull, which is a case that revolves around the very real issue of domestic violence in this era. So Margaret and William were married in New York in an unknown year. So they actually, in the divorce petition, they put, the lawyer writes out, "We're married in blank," and he leaves a blank, and then they just never fill it in. I think that sometimes happens. They're like, "We'll look it up," and then they never figure it out. So I don't know when they were married, but I do know that they arrived in Wheeling in 1848. When they arrived, William had some money, and he basically opened a boot and shoe store on the west side of Main Street between Madison and Union Street. And that the family lived above the store, which was really common in this era for a lot of shopkeepers to have the shop and then their family live above the store. But it makes for a really interesting situation in which there's a lot of blurring between work and home, and the neighbors are very involved not only in what's happening in the store, but what's happening in those households. So she basically says they arrived in 1848 and he abandoned her in October of 1853. At the time he abandons her, they've had 10 children, but they have 6 living. They range in age from 2 to 14. And she basically says in this petition that there's a years-long pattern of cruelty and violence toward her. So she says he often struck her, spit in her face, and threatened to shoot her. He once drew a knife upon her and threatened to, quote, rip her up. And that for months before his abandonment, she was so afraid of him that she would actually lock herself into kind of an attic in their apartment to stay away from him at night. She also says that he forces her to work both in the home, but also in this boot and shoe store, and doesn't permit her to hire a servant, even when she's kind of been ill. And she says, meanwhile, so in this kind of this pattern of trying to show not only is he a bad husband, she's been a good wife. She says, quote, she patiently submitted to the ill treatment to which she was subjected. She made no complaint and endeavored to obey every command. So she's trying to really earn the sympathy of the court there. So his abandonment happens, like I said, in October of 1853. He basically says to her that he's going to go to Zanesville, Ohio, to collect money from the railroad. He takes all the money they have in their house, which is $100. Then he withdraws all their money from the Merchants and Mechanics Bank of Wheeling, and then he leaves town. They don't hear anything of him for 4 weeks, at which point a neighbor gets a letter. And the letter says that he is on board of a ship in the city of New York, just about leaving for Australia. He says, I agreed to ship for Australia with a side promise that I should be appointed an overseer of the mines. Before this reaches you, I will be many miles away on the mighty deep. Before me, a long voyage and an unknown land. And then he says, side note, I changed my name so that my wife can't find me. Yes. So she says the reason she has to file is because in his capacity as a boot and shoe owner, he made a lot of debts. And she is now going to be responsible for all of his debts. And of course, as she already said, she has 6 children she has to raise. And so she's basically like, any money I get, I need for these 6 children. I need to be divorced from this guy. So the depositions come from neighbors and from her own family. So her 14-year-old daughter actually testifies to a lot of this violence, and it makes sense her children would have been the most privy to this violence, and says he threatened once that he would kill her by blowing her brains out with a pistol, and threatened a great many times that he would kill her in my presence. She says she saw him draw a knife, kick her, strike her in the face, throw boiling tea in her face, and spit tobacco in her face. So she's able to list this litany of abuses. My students are often very shocked when they read this one, how much she really has to show that happened to her. And he said he would reduce her to such poverty that she would have to go to the wash tub for a living or beg. Basically, she would have to wash clothes for a living. And she says that of this attic that she had to stay in, she says it was a bare room. It was a room with bare walls, no furniture except the beds. The children slept there with her. The first night my mother had to go up there, my father cursed and swore all of the time and took the dishes off of the table and threw them at the door. He came up to the garret door and tried to get in, but it was fastened. So it's very evocative and detailed testimony about what's going on in here. She also has a lot of neighbors that testify, and a lot of them really talk about how harshly he treated her, the way he spoke to her. But one thing they really focus on is that every time they go into the shop, he's just sitting around like reading a book, and he will be like, hang on a minute, and he calls down his wife from whatever she's doing and makes her wait on people. And they're really offended by this. And they're especially offended because there's clearly a period in which she has a baby, and 2 or 3 days later, they go into the shop and he makes her come down and wait on them. And these are all women, neighbors, who are testifying. This is a man this woman has just had a child, and he's making her come down, and he's making her wait on us. And so there's an interesting moment, in fact, where one woman confronts him and said that his wife should be in bed because it had only been a week since she had a child. And he said it was his business. And she says, quote, I told him I would make it my business to see if she was not taken care of. I told him I would go down the street, and if she was not in a room when I got back, I would see that she could not be put there. So it's an interesting case. Obviously, in the 19th century, attitudes toward domestic violence are not what they are now, but we can see a lot of these women are still willing to kind of confront this man and try to stand up for Margaret where they can. So another woman says his manner to her was that of a master to his slave, and she was very submissive and obedient to him. So also a very telling comment in an era in which obviously there are actual enslaved people in this community. She does get a divorce, but my students are always very upset because she only gets a separation from bed and board. And that's because cruelty isn't grounds for an absolute divorce in this era, and he's only been gone for 2 years. And you have to have been gone for 5 years at this point to get that absolute divorce. So what's interesting about that is, well, she doesn't have to pay his debts. She can't remarry. And in the 19th century, to be a woman and not be able to remarry, your choices are going to be really limited to support your 6 children. So it's really hard. All right. So in the post-war period, we have another case. Again, not the people in question. So Jacob and Ellen Strobel married in either April 1858 or 1859. Jacob was a little fuzzy on what year, in Pennsylvania. They were married, and then in 1862, he leaves to fight in the Union Army, and he's gone for basically the entire rest of the war for 3 years. He comes back, and he's home for about a week, and during that week, he realizes that Ellen has had a long-term relationship with another man while he was gone. And so he moves out and he files for divorce. So he basically says in this petition, he says, Ellen has committed adultery with John Hunter and, quote, diverse other men. But no one ever actually talks about any of the diverse other men. They're just going to focus on John Hunter. So I don't actually know if she was or if he was just really mad when he wrote that. In this case, all of the testimony comes from shop owners that kind of give us an idea of a little bit what it was like, I guess, maybe to date in this era. I mean, it's an affair, but it's still dating. So the first man is a saloon keeper. He says that John Hunter and Ellen Strobel would come to his place on market days, and they would come with their marketing. They would go into a back room, and there they would share hot whiskey punches. And sometimes strong liquors, which personally, I think a whiskey punch is a strong liquor, but I don't know. He says after drinking, John Hunter would turn to Ellen and say, let us go home now. And he would take up the market baskets and they would go away together. And that happened twice a week for the whole winter. He says this was about a year after Jacob left to go fight in the Civil War. And this man says, I took them to be man and wife because they brought the marketing in together. They took it home together, and generally they acted like husband and wife. Joseph Kramer testifies. He ran Kramer's Hotel on Main Street next to the Grant House. And he says in 1863, Ellen and John would frequently come in for dinner, and John would pay for them both. So this was kind of, again, evidence he was using. Another man was a confectioner at the time of this testimony, but during the war he had run an eating saloon. And he said in 1863, the couple came into his restaurant and ordered oysters, which were very popular in this period. And he says when he brought them the oysters, quote, I saw Hunter with his arm around Strobel's waist with his hand in an improper place. Scandal at the eating salon. And another man testifies that they used to ride around in a buggy together. They're like not hiding this relationship. It's certain. Arthur Higgins is a riverboat pilot from Ohio. And he says he rode the train from Bridgeport to Pittsburgh with the couple, who told him they were going to Pittsburgh to stay at a hotel there. He's actually the first person that mentions that John Hunter is also a Union Army soldier, but it appears to have not had the same level of active service that Jacob Strobel did. He's got a lot more time to hang around in Wheeling. So the court ultimately gives them the divorce. In this case, I actually do know what happens to the people after. Jacob remarries 1 year later to a woman named Caroline Seabright, who had 6 children. I don't know if y'all know anyone with the last name Seabright. I was gonna say, when I was in the band at WU, I had a friend who was, her last name was Seabright, and she was from Wheeling. So, she was a German immigrant, much like actually Jacob and Ellen Strobel also were. So they had 6 children. They lived together. They're actually buried together too. So they appear to have a very nice relationship. John and Ellen Hunter appear to have gotten married. I have no marriage record for them, but they are living together in 1870 in the 7th Ward of Wheeling, and they're listed as having the same last name. And he was listed as a brick manufacturer, and she is listed as keeping house, which was the common job for women in the 19th century. So that's what happens to them. And I think, again, it's a really interesting case. Obviously, the Civil War causes a lot of disruption in marriages. There is a spike throughout the United States, but you can see it in Wheeling of divorces. What's interesting in Wheeling is the spike comes in around, this one is a little early, but a lot of it comes in 1868, which is exactly 3 years after the end of the war. And if you're using the new West Virginia law and you're filing for abandonment, it's 3 years. So there's actually like a little bit of a lag time, and then all of a sudden there's a pop of people filing for divorce. So the last one I have is Elizabeth Gowdy and James Gowdy. I don't have as much detail on this one, but I think it shows some interesting trends of what's happening in this era. So Elizabeth Milliger married James Gowdy on December 17th, 1860 in West Alexander, Pennsylvania. And then she says, at the time she files in 1868, she says, we haven't lived together since December 17th, 1860. So if you were paying very close attention, you may have noticed that that was the same day they got married. They got married, and then apparently, I don't know, within hours, he was like, never mind, because they never lived together. I guess it was as long as they took to get from West Alexander, Pennsylvania to Wheeling. She said he hasn't contributed in any manner whatsoever to her maintenance and support, and that he abandoned her again immediately after their marriage. So she gets a lot of testimony from her family and neighbors, and her family really, they ask her, like, why do you think James abandoned her? And they all say basically the same thing, that his parents were opposed to the marriage, and they're like, why were his parents opposed? And they say universally, it is because she was poor and a German girl. So again, a lot of these cases have people of German background in them, but I also think this shows you the kind of tensions that were within Wheeling as you have this large immigrant community coming in, that there might potentially be a divorce that happens because his family doesn't want him to marry a woman who is German. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this one is that they basically say the only time he supported her was during the Civil War, when we wrote to the governor and told the governor that he had left her and he wasn't supporting her. And then the governor appears to have put pressure on military channels. And so basically James was told, if you don't send $60 to your wife, you're going to be removed from your position as lieutenant. And he did send $60, and he kept his position as lieutenant. But again, she files for divorce in 1868, and she is given ultimately that divorce. So again, this was just a sample. Like I said, there's 27 different cases in the book. This is just 4 of them, but hopefully they give you an idea of all the different things we can learn from looking at these divorce cases. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'd be happy to take questions. I'm gonna just move this way through the room. Yeah.
I just wondered, in some of these cases of abandonment after the Civil War, could be that they had not survived the battlefield and somehow notification wasn't sent to the wife.
It is possible that could have happened. I haven't really seen any that would kind of, I would assume a case like that would really look like he went off to war and then he never kind of came back. They actually usually will say something like they came back. Or there's one guy that goes, he fights for the Union Army in Ohio and he goes off and leaves, but then he actually says, I'm doing this to get away from my wife. He also, all these people writing letters back. And so that one again is pretty clear. And he actually says, I'm going to go on, I'm actually going to desert my regiment and I'm going to go off to California. But so I don't have a case where someone just kind of utterly vanishes after having left. But I think it's possible that that happened elsewhere in cases I don't have. Yeah. Chuck.
Your book is a University Press book, but
Yes.
I know it's also available from Amazon. So
It is.
if people are interested in getting a copy of the book, it's for sale on Amazon. So if you're an Amazon customer, it's easily found.
Yes, it is. It's available from, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's actually, I discovered like 6 months ago, it's available at a bookstore that specializes in romance novels, which I thought was interesting because it's not very romantic. I think someone just saw like heart in the title and got it. But yeah, Amazon.
Also today, we have with us Allison Hillary, who is a very successful librarian in WU libraries. I'm sure very proud of her.
Yeah, library representation. Yeah, both my parents were librarians. So when I got this, would you like to do a talk at the library? I was like, I love libraries. Yeah.
If memory serves me right, I think West Alexander was kind of a place where people could go to look.
Yes.
So that might be what happened there, that they, if the family didn't want that marriage to occur, they may have gone there and then.
By the time he gets back in Wheeling, his parents are closer by.
Right. Now I have a question. At the time, was there anything like alimony or child support or anything like that was awarded to a particular wife?
Yes, so there was definitely alimony and child support. None of these cases have it, but there are cases in which they are charged with paying that. And you can actually get it in the middle of a divorce too. So they actually will order, there's actually a case from later in the book. It's also under the cruelty one. And it's a guy who's very wealthy. And he's drinking and he's abusing his wife. And that case goes on for a long, long, long time. And they actually order him to pay her support during the trial itself. And that one actually, she's not successful. They remain married, but she gets some support during it. So yeah, you could get that either during it or after it. There's also, though I would say, I also have some where they and this happens today, right? They say you have to pay to support her, and then there's like a filing of a year later where they're like, as a reminder, you have to pay to support her. So they're not actually following through on the court's orders. But that does happen, yeah. Someone else have their hand up? Yeah.
I may not have been listening clearly, but the man who had the boot and shoe shop, and then was he the one who disappeared and changed his name?
I went off to Australia and changed his name.
What happens to the ownership of the shop? He's gone, she's here, kids to feed, and no ownership ability to her.
That's a good question. And I think her worry would be that it would be seized by his creditors. I mean, I think that's most likely what could happen immediately, is that they would say he has all these debts, we're going to seize that, which is not only the place where you might earn money, but her home, because they're living above the shop. So I think the divorce itself is potentially an attempt to try to claim some of that. It's probably going to be hard for her to actually get any ownership of that, though. I think she's mostly just trying to stem the losses. But yeah, I think it's going to end up with the creditors is where I think it'll probably go. Yeah. Yeah. It's really sad.
What was the social stigma of divorce in that era? I mean, in today's society, if you said you're divorced, it'd be like, yeah, you have a driver's license, so what?
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that.
There's a lot more social stigma toward divorce in this era. What I find interesting is I would argue there's maybe slightly less in Wheeling than I see in some other communities, because there are more people filing here, for instance, than I see in like Virginia. Because when I wrote the book, I actually lived in Kentucky and West Virginia, and I compared them with Virginia, where very few people are filing at all. You're also much more likely to see people filing for divorce who are in lower social classes. I think the upper classes, it's much more frowned upon. And it's kind of a belief of, if you're wealthy enough and if your daughter was in a situation like this, you might just remove her from it, that you don't actually want her to have the stigma of a divorce, but you have other options to support her. Whereas like, you know, Elizabeth Gowdy, the woman who was her husband didn't want to marry her, she was German. She doesn't have any other options to be able to support herself. She has to get a divorce. So I think there's a little more of like a practical approach among some of the working class in this era, but it's still going to be a stigma, which is why I think the cases are so interesting. I'm amazed at how open they're willing to be in these cases in this era when it would have had a stigma. Yeah.
So of the cases that you reviewed, did any locate information where a significant number of them remarried or not? Like, because of the social stigma and the difficulty.
I actually, of the ones that I was able to find, most of them were remarried. And not necessarily just to the person they ran off with during the Civil War. But yeah, a lot of them did remarry. So I think that's a good point. I think that suggests there was less stigma.
In your research, did you run across a couple who were married, divorced, and remarried their former spouse?
I have at least one case of that happening. It's not in Wheeling. So I have one of the counties I looked at in Virginia is called Tazewell County, Virginia. It was actually part of McDowell County at one point. It's right on the West Virginia line, so it's in Appalachian County. And what's interesting about that one is not only did they marry, divorce, and then remarry, they had to petition the court, because in their first one of them charged the other one with adultery, and the court said you can have a divorce, but you're not allowed to remarry. So they actually had to say, we would like you to lift that, because not only do we want to remarry, but we want to marry each other. So that did happen. Yeah.
Thing like that happened in the situation where the person could not get the divorce, but the other alternative. And then all of a sudden, X number of years later.
Could they file and say, now I'd like to remarry, give me I haven't seen that. I would think that could happen, but none of the cases I ran across had that. I will say the other thing to remember about divorce in the 19th century is that there were a lot of what historians might call informal divorces, which is the idea of, if I was in Wheeling, say, like if I'm Margaret and now the courts told me I can't remarry, and I have 6 children, I'm just gonna leave Wheeling. And if I just go somewhere else, like even if I move to like Morgantown, there's no computers, they can't check. They're not gonna have the court records. I'll just meet someone there and remarry them there. So a lot of people would do things like that. And that's where you do get some bigamy cases where people will be like, I have learned that they were not quite as divorced as I thought. I mean, that's famously what happens to Andrew Jackson and his wife, right? Where her husband told her, I'll file for divorce to get the divorce, and she assumed he was going to, and then he didn't. And so she married Andrew Jackson, and then he wrote, and he was like, guess what? You're not really divorced. We're still married. But now I'm going to use the fact that you married another guy as grounds for divorce. So, and that was a case of, she was in Tennessee by that point, and he was in Kentucky, and it's the 1790s, and it's hard to communicate. So there's a lot of confusion. But yeah.
Were there more women filing for divorce than men?
That's a really good question. Yes. There are more women filing, and that's generally true in the United States in general. And historians have said that that's because women have more of a need for a divorce. So because of the way the law worked for married women, once you were married, you couldn't own property, you couldn't sue, you couldn't be sued, you couldn't testify in court. And so, whereas a man, he has all the same rights whether he's married or not. So he has less of a need to get a divorce, whereas she is like, to earn money, I have to get a divorce. Yeah. And he's just much more likely to go on doing whatever he's doing. So yeah, women are more likely to file than men.
It's amazing how little a lot of this has changed in 150 years.
That's what my students always say. Yes. We actually just did this in my class like a week ago, and that was their big conclusion is a lot of this was, so much of this is so similar. Yeah.
What are the challenges in teaching this material to contemporary students, and what's the gender makeup of your classes currently?
Well, so the class where I do a divorce research project where I actually give them samples of cases from these 3 states, and then I let them kind of to study whatever they want. That's a women in the law class. So my women's history classes tend to be mostly women. But I do a gen ed, like a general education class for non-majors on the history of marriage in the world. And that class is like 50-50. And so I think the biggest thing to get that's hard for students is to, even though there is a lot that's similar now, it's hard for them to get out of their mindset and realize how different things were in the 19th century to not read contemporary social values onto the 19th century.
That often women were treated as second-class citizens.
Yeah. Or even to be like, I don't understand if her husband was doing this, why she just didn't go and do that. You know, and to see how limited her choices would have been at the time, in the ways in which women who are in, you know, say domestic violence instances now are still limited, but they were even more limited by what the law would allow them to do at the time. So that's the biggest thing, is to get students to not think like they're in 2024 anymore. Does that make sense? Other questions? All right. Should I end it or do you end it? All right. Well, thank you all so much. Let me know if you have any more questions. I appreciate you so much. Thanks.